I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
And welcome once again to On the Money, where we're focused not only on the military conflict between Russia and Ukraine, but the economic conflict between Russia and the West. As the US and UK move to ban Russian energy exports, petrol prices continue to spiral. And now the highly influential Institute for Fiscal Studies have issued a warning that Chancellor Rishi Sunak faces what the IF calls is a huge judgment call ahead of the Chancellor's spring statement later this month. What are the options for Sunak? I talked live with IFS Director Paul Johnson. On the Money, after the GB News headlines with Rhiannon Jones.
Thanks, Liam. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. The Home Secretary says Ukrainian refugees with passports can now apply fully online to come to the UK. It means application centres in Europe can focus on helping those who don't have passports. It's after the Ukrainian ambassador to the UK called on Britain to ditch the bureaucratic red tape. Priti Patel told the Commons she's streamlining the approach to those fleeing the conflict.
From Tuesday, I can announce that Ukrainians with passports will no longer need to go to a visa application centre to give their biometrics before they come to the UK. Instead, once their application has been considered and appropriate checks completed, they will receive direct notification that they are eligible for the scheme and can come to the UK. In short, Ukrainians with passports will be able to get permission to come here fully online from wherever they are, and will be able to give their biometrics once in Britain.
Priti Patel speaking earlier. US Vice President Kamala Harris has announced America will give another $50 million to Ukraine for humanitarian aid. Speaking alongside the Polish president in Warsaw, she also said America's delivered Patriot missile systems to Poland, which can track and intercept ballistic missiles. Vice President Harris added that America is prepared to defend every inch of NATO territory.
What compels us also is the moral outrage that all civilized nations feel when we look at what is happening to innocent men, women, children, grandmothers, grandfathers, who are fleeing everything they've known.
The Foreign Secretary Liz Truss says the UK is concerned about the potential use of chemical weapons in Ukraine. She's in Brussels for an intensive day of diplomacy. The Ministry of Defence says Russia's confirmed it is using vacuum bombs in Ukraine. Powerful thermobaric rockets aren't illegal, but they are strictly regulated. The MOD says it's also likely Russia's deploying private mercenary soldiers. The Ukrainian president has called an airstrike on a maternity. Volodymyr Zelensky says 3 people died in the attack, including a child, and at least 17 were wounded. The hospital was one of 3 hit by Russian forces yesterday. Boris Johnson says the bombing shows Putin's careless disregard for international humanitarian law. President Zelensky has described the aerial assault as conclusive evidence of genocide. Sports Minister Nadine Dorries says that if Chelsea is sold, Roman Abramovich must not benefit. The football club owner was added to the UK sanctions list this morning. Described as pro-Kremlin, a pro-Kremlin oligarch, Mr Abramovich has been hit with an asset freeze and a travel ban. The government says the licence for Chelsea will be kept under constant review. The club will continue playing its matches. Labour's calling on the government to ramp up its production of green energy, and that's in the wake of rising global energy prices. A survey by Compare the Market suggests that a third of families are struggling to pay their household bills. It's as fuel prices hit a record high of 159.6 pence per litre for petrol and 167.4 pence for diesel. The government says it'll unveil its energy supply strategy in the coming days. That's after committing to phase out Russian oil imports by the end of the year. NHS England says a record 6.1 million people are on waiting lists for routine hospital treatment. Meanwhile, a quarter of suspected cancer patients failed to get a specialist within 2 weeks of seeing their GP. The government wants to eliminate waits of more than 52 weeks by 2025. And the Duchess of Cornwall will celebrate the outstanding contribution of volunteers as part of celebrations for the Queen's Platinum Jubilee year. Organised by the Royal Voluntary Service, of which Camilla is president, the Platinum Champions Awards will recognise those who make a difference to the lives of others. The Duchess says the top winners will be invited to a special edition of the Big Jubilee Lunch on June the 5th. This is GB News. We'll bring you more as it happens. Now, though, let's return to Liam and On the Money.
And coming up on the money today, global commodity markets remain in turmoil as Russia and the West sanction international energy trade. The RAC issues new petrol and diesel price predictions. What joy as we creep towards £2 per litre. It already costs almost 100 quid to fill up a family car. As refugees continue to flee the Russian invasion, GB News reports live from the Poland-Ukraine border. How many will leave this country of 44 million? Where will they go? And what are we doing to help them? Plus, today's Money Talks is with Tony Stein. He's Chief Executive of Healthcare Management Solutions, which employs over 2,000 across 60 care homes across Britain. We discuss the UK's looming social care funding issues, plus the emotional toll of the COVID pandemic.
There's a lot of emotion in the whole of the pandemic for the staff, and I think people forget that. So 2 years on now, what we are seeing is there's quite a lot of mental exhaustion, emotional exhaustion amongst the workforce, and we've lost an awful lot of people. And I think people are missing that at a fundamental level. We've got staffing issues in the care sector anyway, and the pandemic's really exacerbated that.
As ever here on The Money, I want your questions, opinions, ideas. What do you think of the issues raised in today's show? What do you think of petrol at £2 a litre? Email gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet @gbnews. I'll read some of your messages later in the show, so stay with us. This is GB News. I'm Liam Halligan. You're on The Money. Now, with global energy markets still in turmoil, the RACs this morning raised its petrol price predictions. The motoring organisation says the average cost per litre will top £1.60 this week, with diesel set to hit £1.70. The cost of filling an average family car with diesel has already topped £90 for the first time, and in some parts of the UK, the costs are much higher still. As this cost of living squeeze tightens, Rishi Sunak's coming under pressure to do more to help struggling households in his upcoming spring statement, due on Wednesday the 23rd of March. Designed to be a sort of mini budget, the Chancellor's spring statement is taking on huge importance in light of this military war between Russia and Ukraine and the related East-West economic conflict. The highly respected Institute for Fiscal Studies says the cost of living squeeze means Sunak faces, quote, a huge judgment call over whether or not to borrow more, given the vast amounts spent on furlough and other pandemic measures. As fuel and energy prices spiral, will the Chancellor do more to protect those on moderate incomes from rising energy costs, asked the IFS. If not, the public faces the biggest hit to household incomes at least since the 2008 financial crisis. Now, today's IFS report focuses on the 1 in 5 of all workers employed by the public sector, including doctors, nurses and state school teachers. As the cost of living rises, Sunak's going to have to find more money from somewhere, says the IFS, to avoid a painful public sector pay squeeze. There are around, 5.7 million public sector workers. And even before this Russia-Ukraine conflict, inflation was on course to reach around 7% this year as the cost of living squeeze bites. If public sector pay is to keep up, even with this inflation rate, the Chancellor needs to find an extra £10 billion, says the IFS. That's equivalent to an extra 2 pence or so on the basic rate of income tax. During this COVID pandemic, our youthful Chancellor borrowed heavily to fund anti-COVID health measures and support schemes. Now this Russia-Ukraine conflict and related East-West economic war puts our public finances under even more pressure. As inflation rises and living standards slide for millions, what can the government actually afford to do? And that's our On the Money question today. Can Rishi Sunak counter the cost of living squeeze? I'm delighted to be joined by Paul Johnson, one of Britain's leading economists, director at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Paul, you're welcome on my show. Thank you for joining me. This is quite an interesting report the IFS has put together. As ever, you focused on public sector pay. How acute is this judgment call that the Chancellor has to make ahead of his spring statement?
Well, he's got 2 or 3 really big judgment calls here. One is, of course, about households as a whole, not just in the public sector. The package he came up with in February to protect people from the increase in energy prices looked big at the time, £9 billion. But given that it looks like our energy bills are going to go up now by something like 40 billion, it doesn't look so big anymore. So first of all, is he going to come back with more for households as a whole? And then secondly, as you say, what's he going to do about public spending on public services, and in particular for those public sector workers? He set his 3-year spending review last October when he thought that inflation might peak at 3 or 4%. It now looks like it'll go to 8% or more. And of course, if he's only giving public sector workers like teachers 3 or 4%, that's another big cut in their earnings. And don't forget, teachers particularly, but a lot of other public sector workers have seen really big cuts in their earnings over the last decade, much more so than has been the case in the private sector.
Paul, you and I are of similar age. We were kids in the 70s watching the TV news as we did. It's starting to feel a bit like the 70s to me. If public sector workers don't get at least inflation-linked pay rises, there could be more industrial action. Politics could get pretty sticky for the Chancellor.
Yeah, politics is very sticky when you've got this horrible set of things that are going on. I mean, we have been made worse off, first of all by COVID, and secondly by this massive increase in energy prices. There's just no getting away from that. So all the Chancellor can do is, for a period, mitigate some of that pain. He's not going to be able to make all of it go away. We've got higher inflation than we've had at any time for a generation, driven by, in particular, energy prices, but not just energy prices. And that's going to make people feel a lot worse off unless they get some pretty hefty pay rises, much heftier than we've been used to, again, for decades. Now, whether that will lead to the sorts of winter of discontent that you and I can remember back in the winter of 1978-79, I think it's less likely, because unions, frankly, just aren't as strong as they used to be. Although if they are strong anywhere, it's in the public sector. They certainly don't have much strength in the private sector anymore.
That's true. And I think it's fair to point out, for the 4/5 of people who don't work in the public sector, that public sector pay is already on average higher than in the private sector. I mean, traditionally that hasn't been the case, but it has been the case in recent years. I think it's about 10% higher on IFS numbers. So if he does give a really, well, not generous, but inflation-linked settlement to the public sector, a lot of private sector people, more voters, they could be upset by that.
Yeah, it's important to be clear that public sector pay, if you just take the average, is a little bit higher than in the private sector. That's because far more people in the public sector are graduates, so doctors and nurses and teachers and so on. They're all graduates, and obviously on average graduates earn more than non-graduates, and once you account for that, there's really not that much difference. In fact, the public sector pay relative to private sector pay is at its lowest ever at the at the moment. But you're right. I think one of the things that the Chancellor will certainly have in mind is if we end up with big pay settlements in the public sector, that may well set a norm for the private sector. So he's going to have that in mind, as well as what's affordable, and of course as well as what he needs to put in place in order to recruit and retain the teachers and nurses and so on, that he absolutely needs to be able to recruit and retain. And don't forget, whatever else is going on, we know we've got a pretty tight labour market at the moment. There's huge numbers of vacancies, lots of people moving around. It's to some extent it's a labour market which favours the worker at the moment, so he's not going to wanting to be taking too many risks, particularly, for example, when he's got to deliver huge amounts on the NHS. You've just reported on the further increase in the numbers of people on NHS waiting lists. Well, does he give low pay increases to NHS staff so that he's got more money for employing more of them? Or if he gives them low pay increases, does he risk losing a lot of them to other jobs?
You've been very generous with your time, Paul. I want to move on to my other guests, but I just want to ask you one brief thing before you go, if you don't mind. The big change since we last spoke is, of course, the focus on defence spending. Back in the 50s, it was 8% of GDP. It's now less than 2% of GDP. He's going to have to find more money for defence as well, isn't he?
Well, I certainly think he's going to need to find some more. I mean, one of the things worth saying is that back in the October spending review, defence was the only major bit of spending which was on its way down over the next 3 years. Everything else was on its way up. And secondly, actually, the MOD uses an awful lot of fuel. So simply to offset the cost of that's going to cost him a bit. But more generally, the pressure on defence spending is going to be ever upwards. Having been, as you say, on a very long trajectory down, it's one of the things that has allowed us really to build our welfare state over the last 50 years, is that we've stopped spending anywhere near so much on defence and started spending it, especially on health. Well, that's a trick we're not going to be able to make again.
Paul, great to have you on the show. I look forward to speaking to you in the coming weeks ahead of that spring statement. Paul Johnson there, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. A fabulous place to rummage around to look for real independent analysis on the UK's public finances. Check out their website. I'm joined now by Parmjit Dhanda, a former government minister under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and a former trade union official, to discuss public sector pay, and Jasmine Birtles. She's back in the studio. She's founder of MoneyMagpie.com. Welcome to you too, Jasmine. Let's talk to you, Parmjit. Thanks for joining us here on The Money. I mean, Paul Johnson put it beautifully. His analysis wasn't pretty, but it was very concise.
Yeah.
He does face a huge judgment call, doesn't he, the Chancellor of the Exchequer?
He does. And Liam, who firstly would want to be Chancellor of the Exchequer right now? You've come out of one massive crisis with on COVID, and then we enter this particular one with a war in Europe. So it's incredibly tough, difficult decisions. I thought Paul Johnson's analysis was actually very good. We do need to keep people in the public sector. We desperately need people working in the health service. We still haven't got over the last crisis around COVID. I hope that one of the things that the Chancellor looks at is some of the long-term issues that need to be dealt with. Certainly, I mean, I remember being in government back in the time of the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. And you couldn't just think about the day-to-day. You had to think about the long-term. And right now, we know there are real issues in this country in terms of energy supply. So I think the government really should have had a long-term plan in place in terms of nuclear energy. It would have given us a level of independence. It decreases carbon as well, and we wouldn't be finding ourselves in quite the mess that we are in our reliance on places like Russia for our fuel. We also need to, in the shorter term, find an alternative to the gas and oil coming from places that are just totally unstable, and look to do more with our own natural resources around renewables. And that creates jobs as well. As a trade unionist, yes, we want to see jobs. And if people are in work and people are earning, there is far less chance, Liam, of them struggling to heat their homes and feed their kids. So he will need to think about infrastructure. Not all of it is public sector infrastructure. There are private sector investors out there. A good example is, in my day job, I'm executive director of the Back Heathrow campaign. A new runway would create 180,000 jobs and products that advance trade and create wealth. So he does need to think about the long term as well as the immediate problems that we have.
Jasmine Birtles, let's turn to you. You bring your own sharp analysis to the On the Money studio. You also bring the thoughts and feelings of lots of your readers on your website, moneymagpie.com. Are your chat rooms buzzing about the spring statements? He needs to go and do something. A spring statement is usually a kind of small mini budget. Nobody really notices it. This is turning into a major parliamentary event, a major policy-making moment.
Yeah, it is. Interestingly, it seems to be the business people that are particularly interested in what's going to happen. For other people, for consumers, it's constantly, you know, as you say, it's £100. I've just filled up my car. It's cost me £100. I'm not going to be able to keep doing this. Somebody else was saying that their energy bills have literally doubled overnight. You know,
and more to come.
Yes, and more to come. I mean, this is what everybody people are not sleeping. You know, I've got some people literally that. So yeah, I mean, I agree with Parmjit. Who would be Chancellor at this time? Honestly, he is between a rock and a hard place. You know, if he's talking to his the voters, they will want him to borrow more. But a lot of people will be looking at how much we've already borrowed. I mean, according to the ONS, back in last March, the government debt was 2,024 billion.
Yeah.
Goodness
well
knows
over
what
2 trillion.
Yeah, exactly. Whatever.
Interest rates are going up. You've got to service that debt. Money spent on debt services, money not spent on schools, hospitals, the military, which more people are looking for spending.
Yes.
A really tight situation. We're going to carry on this discussion after the break there with Jasmine Birtles and Parmjit Dhanda. Well, this is On the Money with me, Liam Halligan. We will keep this discussion going, and your emails are already flooding in thick and fast. We'll be reading some of those shortly. Stay with us. You're On the Money.
Hello, quite a lot of cloud across the country today. It's a breezy one for many of us, but it is on the mild side, and there will be a little bit of brightness, particularly in the far east and the far west. Now, at the moment, we have this large area of high pressure across the continent, and that's blocking these weather fronts. So those weather fronts pushing up against the high pressure, they've got nowhere to go. So they're just sticking around for quite some time. And that's the reason for all this cloud across the country, outbreaks of patchy light rain or drizzle at times associated with that cloud. But as I mentioned, there will be some brightness around, particularly for western extremities of the country, and also parts of East Anglia and South East England are likely to see some sunshine through the course of the day. Temperature-wise, on the mild side, but it will be quite a breezy one for most of us. Now, through this evening and overnight, we keep hold of this cloud, further outbreaks of rain or drizzle at times. In fact, there could be some heavier bursts through the course of the night tonight. Still a few clearer spells, but they will be fairly limited. And with all that cloud around, it will be a mild night for just about all of us. So it starts tomorrow on quite a cloudy note, and again there will be some outbreaks of rain at times, but tomorrow we see this area of low pressure pushing in from the southwest, and this will introduce some more persistent rain at times. That will gradually push northwards through the course of the day, and there could be some heavier bursts within that. So again, quite a cloudy day, outbreaks of rain, and then turning showery as that weather front clears through across more southwestern parts of the country, and some of those showers could be on the heavy side. It will be a windy day for just about all of us tomorrow, but again, temperatures above where they would normally be at this time of year, and that's because of the southerly airflow. And there's very little change actually as we head into the weekend, remaining cloudy and fairly breezy, but generally on the mild side. Bye for now.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. You're on the money. It's 126 now as inflation rises and living standards unfortunately slide. What can the government actually afford to do to help us? Today we're discussing that key question. Can Rishi Sunak counter the cost of living squeeze? I'm still with my panel, Parmjit Dhanda, former trade union official, former Labour government minister, Jasmine Birtles, MissMoneyMagpie.com, and we're joined also now by Richard Hunter. He's head of markets at Interactive Investor. Richard, thanks for joining me here on the money. Can't he just borrow more? Can't he just do more quantitative easing, as we now have to call money printing?
Well, he can, but as your guests have quite rightly been saying, this is a fairly pivotal moment. I don't think anyone is under any illusions that the largesse that we saw from the government during the height of the pandemic, be that the furlough scheme, business rates relief, VAT relief, stamp duty holiday, I don't think there's any question that needs to be repaid. The question is rather whether that should be repaid right now and whether this is the right time to do it. Quite apart from the inflationary pressures the economy had been facing just 2-3 weeks ago, we've obviously now got the rather more pressing issues of what's going on in Europe between Russia and Ukraine. And that may be playing into his thinking about perhaps delaying some of the increases to national insurance contributions, for example, which he had been planning.
Markets guy, Richard, with all respect, you know, commodity markets are jittery. There's a lot of nervousness out there. It was issues in Russia that caused the collapse at the end of the late 90s, if I may rather worryingly remind us. What are the markets going to think if the Chancellor of the UK just keeps borrowing more and more and more money? Our national debt now north of £2 trillion, 100% of GDP. When does this end?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, a lot of that is going to be allied to the developing situation between Russia and Ukraine, of course. I don't think the Chancellor would have any problems in having access to additional funds in terms of international investors and so on. But from a pure housekeeping point of view, of course, the previous situation was quite perturbing in terms of the addition to our lending resulting from the pandemic, let alone if we now exacerbate it. But sometimes needs must. And I think from a humanitarian and business point of view, the question is to get us through this particular period of difficulty and potentially count the cost later.
Parmjit, back to you. You were generous enough to say that the Conservative Rishi Sunak does face a really difficult task with this spring statement, let alone the full-scale budget in the autumn. What would you do?
Well, he can't run away and hide, and he's got some really difficult decisions ahead of him. He's facing a political squeeze from both sides as well. As quite rightly just been mentioned, there's an NI increase due in April. So he's got to rapidly make some decisions about whether he still wants to do that, whether that's the right thing or not at this time. I have got no issue for the reasons behind it in terms of greater investment into social care in the NHS. But whether that's affordable at this time, I think he also needs to think about what's cheaper in the long run. It's cheaper for people not to lose their homes, and to be able to afford their mortgages. So I think that will be high up in his mind. It's better for people not to be so hungry that they end up ill and having to use public services, safety nets, and also the NHS to a greater degree. So that needs to go into his thinking as well. And then there's some economic triggers. I can certainly recall we really had problems with the banking collapse, as I mentioned earlier on, towards the end of Labour's time in government. But a couple of things that really boosted and supported the economy and kind of hit more than one target at the same time were you may recall the boiler scrappage scheme, the car scrappage scheme. There is a push, quite rightly, for more efficient cars, more efficient boilers. So these kinds of schemes can actually give the economy a bit of a kickstart, support jobs, and keep the economy strong, or stronger than it otherwise would be.
Parmjit reminded us, of course, as if we needed reminding, that national insurance increase is coming in April. It's been legislated for both employers and employees. The Labour Party says that Rishi Sunak shouldn't go ahead with that. And the Tory Party is saying, no, we must raise taxes. It's a complete reversal of the normal state of affairs.
Yeah, very good point. I mean, I agree with Labour. I've been saying, and I've said on this programme, this is not the time to add, and it's not just for consumers, it's for businesses as well. I run a small business, I've got employees, so my
it's a tax on jobs.
It's a tax on jobs, and it means that, of course, I will need to increase prices in where I am, and we've already got this with very small businesses like cafes, etc., whose energy bills have rocketed, so they're having to increase prices. So that means that quite a lot of businesses could be put out of business because their customers simply won't be able to pay the higher prices.
Let's go back to Richard Hunter for one last comment. Richard, how jittery is it feeling on financial markets now? We don't want to be alarmist, we don't want to spread fear, but it's feeling like a sort of, not quite a once-in-a-generation moment, but it's feeling like a very unusually febrile situation to me.
Yeah, I suspect we've been through worse. The height of the great financial crisis was rather more of a shock. This unfortunate situation we're in at the moment, we have been building up to for some time now. That being said, there's no question that volatility is high and sentiment is extremely fragile. We've seen that over the last couple of days. The FTSE 100, for example, had a very strong day yesterday, finished up about 3.25%, where it's had to give up some of those gains today, despite some strong showings from Wall Street and Asia overnight. So I suspect where we are at the moment is that certainly in the near term, we're going to continue to be news-driven rather than fundamental-driven, with sentiment remaining very fragile.
For that thought, Richard Hunter there of Interactive Investor. Thank you to Parmjit Danda, former trade union official and, of course, Labour government minister, and indeed Jasmine Birtles. Great to have you in the studio as ever, Miss Money Magpie. Thanks to all my panel. This is On the Money with me, Liam Halligan. After the break, we'll be hearing live from the Polish border with Ukraine. And also, it's Money Talks.
I think it's unfair for operators to point the finger anywhere at themselves other than themselves. If they took people into their homes and they didn't know whether they were positive or not, but they couldn't safely manage that, they shouldn't have taken them. So really, it's not an issue of government. This is not an issue of NHS policy and process. It's an issue of, how did the operators manage their care homes at that time?
For my latest in-depth daily interview, I sat down with Tony Stein, Chief Executive of Healthcare Management Solutions, to talk about navigating care home management during the pandemic. All that's after the GB News headlines with Rhiannon Jones.
Thanks, Liam. It's 1:34. Your top stories from the GB newsroom. US Vice President Kamala Harris has announced America will give another $50 million to Ukraine for humanitarian aid. Speaking alongside the Polish president in Warsaw, she also said America's delivered Patriot missile systems to Poland, which can track and intercept ballistic missiles. She added that America is prepared to defend every inch of NATO territory. The Ukrainian president has called an airstrike on a maternity hospital in Mariupol a war crime. It's being reported 3 people died in the attack, including a child, and at least 17 people were wounded. The hospital is one of 3 hit by Russian forces yesterday. Sports Minister Nadine Dorries says that if Chelsea is sold, Roman Abramovich must not benefit. The football club owner was added to the UK Sanctions list this morning. Described as a pro-Kremlin oligarch, he's been hit with an asset freeze and a travel ban. The British Army says a small number of soldiers have disobeyed orders and gone absent without leave. It's thought they may have gone to fight in Ukraine. Boris Johnson's warned soldiers who go AWOL to fight against the Russian invasion of Ukraine will face court-martial on their return to the UK. In other news, a survey by Compare the Market suggests that 1/3 of families are struggling to pay their household bills. That as the average price of petrol nears a record £1.60 a litre. And NHS England says a record 6.1 million people are on waiting lists for routine hospital treatment. Meanwhile, 1/4 of suspected cancer patients failed to get to a specialist within 2 weeks of seeing their GP. TV online and DAB Plus radio, this is GB News. It's back to On the Money with Liam in just a moment.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows. Every day, we ask the questions that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. You're on the money with me, Liam Halligan, on GB News TV and DAB Plus digital radio. Now, huge numbers have been fleeing cities across Ukraine in what is the fastest growing refugee crisis in Europe since the Second World War. And it's just been announced that from Tuesday, Ukrainian nationals with a passport or ID card can apply for a British visa entirely virtually, that is, online, without having to visit a visa application centre. That's been agreed following advice from the British Security Services. Our GB News reporter Bradley Harris is in Promotional, Poland. Bradley, you've been reporting on this for quite a few days now as the crisis worsens for Ukrainian people leaving their homeland. What are your thoughts about your time in Poland?
Well, my thoughts have changed massively over the last 3 days, Liam. When I first arrived here, I expected a lot of chaos, a lot of disorganisation. But actually, I'm surprised at how many people, not just in Poland, but across the world, have come together to show their support for Ukrainians who are currently and still are fleeing their country. I've been at the border at Mitigation, where hundreds still are crossing the border into Poland. And where do they go from there? Because they can't stay there. They go on to coaches that take them to all different parts of Poland. One place is here in Promotional, the city closest to the border. We're actually standing in a Tesco car park, no longer a Tesco now. It's actually a place where refugees from Ukraine are currently staying for many nights. The coaches are parked up, and there's a couple of refugees from Ukraine who are having lunch right now. Sausages that are made by volunteers. One guy from Germany who's travelled all the way from Germany to cook these sausages and to feed Ukrainians who have come with next to nothing. I want to chat to Jana, who is a Ukrainian. Where in Ukraine have you come from?
We come here from Ukraine, West Ukraine, and we don't feel unsafe in our home. And we decided to come here and save our children.
What has happened to your house?
Now we have war in our country, and it's very horrible.
How are people helping you here?
These people help us, and we have free food and житло, free. We can to stay here, and we have free clothes and
people are helping you with free clothes and food. It's incredible, isn't it? It's good to chat to you, Jana. It's incredible still. It still surprises me that people come here with nothing at all and they are being offered free clothes, free food. Jana is here waiting to find out where she's going to stay next. Right now, she hasn't got any idea where she's staying. We're currently both in a car park in what was once a Tesco here in Poland. The future is looking a bit blurred for Jana, but hopefully soon there'll be some clarity as to where her life will take her next.
Bradley Harris there, reporting from Promotional in Poland, near to the Ukrainian border for GB News. Bravo. Time now for my daily interview series, Money Talks. Now, as most of us know, COVID has had a huge impact on Britain's care sector, with around 40,000 care home residents unfortunately dying between 2020 and 2021. And with staff shortages and inflation taking effect, the pandemic is just one factor among many, which mean parts of the care sector are struggling. I sat down with Tony Stein. He's Chief Exec of Healthcare Management Solutions, or HCMS. That's a major provider of care home services, employing over 2,000 people across 60 UK care homes. So here he is, Tony Stein of Healthcare Management Solutions, my latest guest on Money Talks. Tony, great to have you on Money Talks. You're in charge of 60-odd care homes. Tell us how the pandemic was across those care homes that you run. It must have been a big challenge.
It was a huge challenge. We had an early start. The GP who came across from a skiing holiday and a conference and was one of the first people to be considered a spreader of the virus, went to one of our care homes. We were the first care home with a known contact with COVID back in February 2020. There was virtually no guidance out at that time. Public Health England and CQC hadn't really got going at that point. So we were pretty much making it up on the fly. But I have to say that early jolt for us really gave us a bit of a head start. So in the first wave, we had a remarkably low death rate in our care homes. we learnt a lot very quickly. We learnt how to communicate very clearly with our staff and our relatives and our residents. And it stood us in really good stead. The trickiest part, though, for the whole of, I think for the whole sector and for us, was that managing that issue of transitioning staff backwards and forwards to home and back into the services and making sure they weren't bringing the virus in, and where we did have outbreaks, that the staff didn't blame themselves. There was an awful lot of that. So there's a lot of emotion in the whole of the pandemic for the staff. And I think people forget that. So 2 years on now, what we are seeing is there's quite a lot of mental exhaustion, emotional exhaustion amongst the workforce. And we've lost an awful lot of people. And I think people are missing that at a fundamental level. We've got staffing issues in the care sector anyway, and the pandemic's really exacerbated that. So a lot of really good managers have left. We've lost years and years of experience, and finding a way to replace that is tricky. So that's where we are.
As a GB News presenter, as a Telegraph columnist, I get lots and lots of emails. My impression from my own family's experience, from people that correspond with me about the care home sector during the pandemic is mixed. There's an awful lot of praise for individual care home staff, even for some care homes per se, but there's also quite a lot of anger, particularly about trying to access loved ones during the pandemic. And you've lived and breathed this now for getting on for 2 years, Tony, and we can talk about that. But before we talk about that very human frontline aspect of what you've been dealing with across the 65 care homes that you're responsible for, spool us back to that time when it became clear that what the NHS was doing was moving old people, elderly, vulnerable people out of the healthcare system and into care homes. And many of those people, it turned out, unfortunately, already had COVID. How was it like? How was it dealing with that?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked me that question, because this is one that's really taxed me over the last couple of years. The myth that is going around is that somehow the NHS and the government were in some way culpable for deaths in care services as a result of discharging untested people into care homes. And I say it's a myth. And it's a myth because as a care home operator, I have a statutory obligation to refuse to take anybody into my care home who I believe I can't care for safely. That's my responsibility alone. You know, the government, the NHS don't send ambulances around to care homes and just boot people out and say, here you go. This is not how it works. So we took a view right at the beginning that if the country was to survive the pandemic, we all had to work together. Our staff are trained in the management of contagious disease, and we had to decide very quickly which care homes we felt were capable of managing that process, were capable of isolating people that came into our home safely until we knew they were not COVID positive. And some homes we felt could do that, and some homes we felt couldn't, for a variety of reasons. Maybe the layout of the home, maybe the dependency of the residents in the home. And we had a very, very, as I say, very low death rate during that initial first outbreak. I think it's unfair for operators to point the finger anywhere at themselves other than themselves. If they took people into their homes and they didn't know whether they were positive or not, but they couldn't safely manage that, they shouldn't have taken them. So really, it's not an issue of government. This is not an issue of NHS policy and process. It's an issue of, you know, how did the operators manage their care homes at that time?
So that's very interesting. You know, few people in the country as experienced as you in this sector. You are literally an industry leader. Healthcare Management Solutions is a major name, and you're a major name in this sector. And you're saying it wasn't the NHS's fault. It was the fault of individual care home operators not being able to handle the situation when they had basically accepted that they could handle it by allowing the people into their care homes in the first place?
They accepted them. You know, it's no. If you take somebody into your home, you're effectively putting your hand up and saying, "I can safely look after this individual." If they felt that there was a risk that maybe they were COVID positive, but they couldn't be certain that they could isolate them properly, they couldn't manage the barrier nursing, they couldn't handle the infection control within the environment that they had, they should have just said no. And that was perfectly their right to do that. So no, I don't think that's. I think that's a myth, and I think that's something that we should get out of our heads. I think you mentioned the visiting as well, and the way that other operators have handled that through the pandemic. This is another issue that I think people forget, that as a highly regulated business, we have to follow guidance. We have no option. If we don't follow guidance, we're not covered by our insurers. You know, we're also at risk of prosecution. So whatever the guidance says, we have to do it. We can't just make a decision and say, no, great, we like our visitors and our residents need those people, so let's let them in.
Do you think there were instances, Tony, where the guidance you and your staff were rightly following was a little bit harsh, a little bit inhumane in circumstances, not being able to hold the hand of loved ones as they died, even when the spouses had been, you know, triple checked and had a lot less chance of having COVID, with all respect, than the care home staff?
I think with hindsight, without a doubt, but hindsight's a wonderful thing, and you have to put this into context. I think at the time, people were incredibly worried. When you're running a home, you've got potentially 60, 80, 100 residents in that home. The idea of allowing somebody in who, and you've got to remember as well, you say been triple checked. At the beginning, for the first, 6, 7, 8 months, testing wasn't ubiquitous, you know, in the way it is now. We didn't have access to that. You know, PPE for some providers was scarce. I mean, we never ran out, thank goodness, but it wasn't as if it was, you know, really easy to get hold of. And I also think that our first thought was, you know, this is a terrible imposition on this individual and their family, but if 60 people die as a result of this, you know, of us saying it would be nice.
It is an environment, in all fairness to you, with people we know to be extremely vulnerable, obviously by definition elderly, often unfortunately with medical conditions and immunity issues, of course. Let me put this to you, Tony. There's a lot of debate, or there's a lot of debate under the surface about our care sector, social care more generally. The government is going to face a lot of criticism for this national insurance rise in April, which it says it's partly about the NHS backlog. It's partly also about trying to tackle social care. Do you think it's true to say this is the first government in a long time that's prepared to actually acknowledge there's a problem and do something about it? Or do you still think we're miles away from getting our arms around the issue of reforming our social care system in a country that is, you know, rapidly getting older?
Yeah. Wow. There have been successive papers out from government after government after government of both stripes. I would say all stripes, but there's only really two over the years, and we've never really made much progress. I think politically it was always unpalatable. The solution always involved raising taxes, and nobody ever wanted to do it. So when the government announced the increase in national insurance, I was doing somersaults, I'll be honest with you. We have an ageing population. The NHS, founded back in the 40s, God, I mean, mission creep doesn't enter into it. You know, what it does today is not what it did and what it set out to do. It does so much more. And it's grown large, and it's grown overweight and bloated and inefficient. So there's a huge expense there. But we have an ageing population that needs funding properly through the sort of difficulties of managing this body of people that are growing older and living longer with conditions that need attention and care.
Tony Stein, fascinating. CEO of Healthcare Management Solutions. Thanks for talking to me.
Pleasure. Lovely. Thanks, Liam.
And that was Tony Stein, the Chief Executive of Healthcare Management Solutions. You can listen to the full version of that interview now on my Money Talks podcast, on the GB News app, or via the GB News YouTube channel. And don't forget to subscribe to that YouTube channel. Let's bring in now, finally, some of your views. Patrick emailed gbviews@gbnews.uk to say perhaps the government should consider dropping the taxes currently included in the fuel price. Tens of billions of pounds of fuel duty. They'd have to find the money from somewhere else. Anne says, if Rishi Sunak hadn't been so irresponsible handing out furlough money like candy, then writing the fraud off, I think would be in a better place. Anne's referring, I think, to those continuity business loans, so-called C-bills. Lou contacted us to say there seems to be very little comment about the impact of the cost of living crisis on pensioners, especially those who don't have inflation-linked final salary pensions. There are many of us that are struggling. Point well made, Lou. Claire, it's disheartening, she says, to see what's happening to our country. I feel I did everything right, saving, preparing for retirement, spending less than I earn. But for what? It's all going up in smoke thanks to inflation. Keep your emails coming, gbviews@gbnews.uk. That's all we've got time for. Thanks for joining me today. I'll be back tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a 2-hour double whammy. This is GB News. I'm Liam Halligan, and that was On the Money.
Hello, quite a lot of cloud across the country today. It's a breezy one for many of us, but it is on the mild side, and there will be a little bit of brightness, particularly in the far east and the far west. Now, at the moment, we have this large area of high pressure across the continent, and that's blocking these weather fronts. So those weather fronts pushing up against the high pressure, they've got nowhere to go. So they're just sticking around for quite some time. And that's the reason for all this cloud across the country, outbreaks of patchy light rain or drizzle at times associated with that cloud. But as I mentioned, there will be some brightness around, particularly for western extremities of the country, and also parts of East Anglia and South East England are likely to see some sunshine through the course of the day. Temperature-wise, on the mild side, but it will be quite a breezy one for most of us. Now, through this evening and overnight, we keep hold of this cloud, further outbreaks of rain or drizzle at times. In fact, there could be some heavier bursts through the course of the night tonight. Still a few clearer spells, but they will be fairly limited. And with all that cloud around, it will be a mild night for just about all of us. So it starts tomorrow on quite a cloudy note, and again there will be some outbreaks of rain at times, but tomorrow we see this area of low pressure pushing in from the southwest, and this will introduce some more persistent rain at times. That will gradually push northwards through the course of the day, and there could be some heavier bursts within that. So again, quite a cloudy day, outbreaks of rain, and then turning showery as that weather front clears through across more southwestern parts of the country, and some of those showers could be on the heavy side. It will be a windy day for just about all of us tomorrow, but again, temperatures above where they would normally be at this time of year, and that's because of the southerly airflow. And there's very little change actually as we head into the weekend, remaining cloudy and fairly breezy, but generally on the mild side. Bye for now.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
A very good afternoon and welcome to a 2-hour special edition of the Briefing PM. Over the next 2 hours, I'll be bringing you the latest political news and debate here on GB News. I'm Darren McCann.